received the Arnoldville Lifetime Achievement Award for distinguished contributions to a nonprofit and voluntary action research. And that was in 1993. He's since then founded and is the chair of a section of Arnoldville known as Community and Grassroots Associations. Very prolific, very influential, very much a pioneer. David would describe himself as an entrepreneur. The point is, I think, that he branched off in a very new direction that sociology was not going in at that time, and indeed is still not going. We remarked the other day how absent in sociological research, purely and simply sociological research, the study of volunteers is. There is no such thing in the American Sociological Association as a section or even recognition of a sociology of volunteering. Yet it is clearly important, clearly a complicated field, and clearly one that Dr. David Horton Smith has himself begun and sent us, on the sociological side anyway, in a very interesting direction. I present to you then Dr. David Horton Smith, who will talk on volunteering and the nonprofit sector.
Good morning. Hardy souls who get up and come to conferences at 9 o'clock in the morning. When the average leisure scientist considers the range of leisure activities, the voluntary nonprofit sector is usually far from his or her mind. It's my goal here to change that in a modest way. Most of what I'm going to talk about would fall into the category of what Professor Robert Stebbins calls serious leisure, though not all of it does so. Serious leisure is leisure dedicated to some serious purpose other than sheer fun. It's trying to accomplish something of some lasting value. At the individual level, leisure in the nonprofit sector usually involves some form of volunteering or quasi-volunteering, and my paper is focused on volunteering mainly. I'll get to the difference between those two in a moment. At the organizational level, leisure in the nonprofit sector usually involves some kind of nonprofit organization or group, of which there are many kinds, but it may also involve service volunteer programs in government agencies and even some kinds of businesses. Proprietary hospitals come to mind. I'll explain what service volunteer programs are again a bit later. The nonprofit sector as a whole in a nation is all of the volunteers, the quasi-volunteers, the nonprofit groups, and the volunteer programs that exist in that nation. Looked at as a slice of all leisure in a nation, nonprofit sector-based individual leisure and volunteering tends to look small, however important it may be substantively. Older time budget studies like that of Zelaya in 1972 found about a median of about 4 minutes a day of volunteering in nonprofit organizations, and about the same amount of time, 4 minutes a day, for religion among the 15 nations that they started. This is about 6% of the total leisure time, so it's a small slice of leisure time according to that study. A more recent study by Hill found about 2.9 hours per week in organizational activity. That's much larger than Zelaya found. This is comparable to an interview-derived estimate of 2.6 hours per week recently from Verba et al. In 1995, including church participation. So it's somewhere between many minutes a week from one study to a couple of hours a week that people are involved in volunteering for nonprofits or volunteering for the church involvement. In the aggregate, volunteer time for the U.S. is immense per year, and most of my paper is going to be based on U.S. documents. Using the Hill estimate from above and applying it to a 1991 adult population estimate, we get 27.6 billion hours of total associational volunteer time. 28.6 billion hours. Associational volunteer time is volunteer time when you're working for a voluntary association, like a grassroots association, not a service volunteer program. Hodgkinson and Weitzman, who take care of service volunteer statistics, estimate that formal volunteer time for service volunteer programs was 15.2 billion in 1991. So both kinds of volunteering, for associations and for service volunteer programs, are very large when accumulated over the whole nation. Another way to look at volunteering and leisure and nonprofit and leisure is to look at a slice of all the organizations and groups in the nation. Nonprofit organizations look like about 6% of the total number of nonprofits, business, and government organizations in the United States in 1992, with businesses being dominant at around 94%. So if you look at all the organizations in the nation, in America and probably in most other nations, businesses dominate and nonprofits are around 5 or 6%. When you do a more sophisticated approach to estimating grassroots associations, the nonprofits turn out to be about 29% of all organizations and groups based on estimates in my book, Grassroots Associations. I estimated there were 9.5 million nonprofits in America around 1990, while Hodgkinson and Weitzman, who are interested in service volunteer programs, only found about 1.4 million. Most of these nonprofits that I found, or found evidence of and estimated, about 7.5 million, were grassroots associations. And I want you to learn an acronym, an abbreviation, so they don't have to say grassroots associations every time I come to it. It comes up again and again in my talk. I want to call them GAs, G for grassroots and A for associations. So people who come in late won't know what I'm talking about. The nonprofit sector has also been looked at as a slice of the economy in many nations. Solomon et al. In their Global Civil Society found a 22-country average of about 5% as a nonprofit sector share of total employment in the country, which means that the people working for nonprofits in the 22 countries that he studied have salaries of about 5% of the total of salaries in that country. But it ranges greatly from about 0.4% in Mexico to 12.6% in the Netherlands. The nonprofit sector had 1.1 trillion, that's trillion, in expenditures in the 22 countries studied, or about 4.6% of gross domestic product. So it's big all over the world. There were 19 million paid employees, amounting to 5% of the total non-agricultural employment in these 22 countries. That's quite a few people. So by all of these three gauges, the nonprofit sector as a source of leisure is modest quantitatively, but it's quite significant nonetheless. I'll try to show that in the rest of my paper. But note that the second two comparisons that I made look at nonprofits in comparison with work organizations and the economy, not other leisure. Work and the economy are dominant forces in human life and human time budgets. Informal leisure and fun, including mass media consumption, socializing, sport and recreation, etc., are dominant forms of leisure activities. Volunteering is not a dominant form of leisure activity, but it's an important form of leisure activity and has a number of important impacts on the societies in which it's found, which is in nearly every society. Therefore, serious leisure, such as volunteering in nonprofit organizations and groups, remain an important facet of the total leisure picture, and a facet that I intend to tell you about today. Some definitions. To understand volunteerism as leisure, I must first present some related definitions from Chapter 1 of my book, Grassroots Associations. First, I define altruism in rough terms as an internal disposition concept referring to the tendency of an entity to try to help others by satisfying such others in some way. In other words, altruism is trying to help somebody. I then define voluntary altruism as a special form of human altruism found particularly in the nonprofit sector, which is humane, freely chosen, biosocially uncoerced, Helpee sensitive, that means that is sensitive to people that are trying to be helped, and unremunerated or under-remunerated relative to the market value of services, and based on a mix of self and other-serving motives. This is the central defining value or goal or motivation of my definitional scheme, voluntary altruism. There's also business altruism when businesses do things to help people, government altruism when governments do things to try to help people. But I'm talking about voluntary altruism, which is defined as I just said. So voluntary altruism is the motivation or goal in volunteering in the nonprofit sector, and voluntary altruistic action is the resulting activity. Voluntary altruistic action is action that results in significant degree from voluntary altruism. So my first concept, voluntary altruism, helps define my second concept, voluntary altruistic action, or just voluntary action. Now we can define a volunteer as a person who does significant amounts of voluntary or altruistic action in a specified time period, like last week, last month, last year. This is how surveys determine who are volunteers. They ask about any volunteer work done in the last some period. There are two main general subtypes of volunteers, and only one of which I'm going to consider in this paper. The kind that I'm going to consider is pure volunteers who are essentially unremunerated. They get no pay for what they're doing. The other kind of volunteer is a quasi-volunteer, where they are essentially under-remunerated for some of their voluntary action during some time period relative to the market value of their services. An amateur sports team member who receives no pay at all is a pure volunteer, the kind of volunteer I want to talk about in this talk. One who receives a small below-market value stipend is a quasi-volunteer. From one point of view, nearly all staff workers of nonprofit organizations are under-remunerated relative to the business sector, and hence are quasi-volunteers. But my interests here are more in pure volunteers, so that's what I will focus on in this talk. There are a couple of other distinctions that I want to make. One has to do with the auspices of volunteering, and there's two subtypes. First, there's informal volunteers who are working on their own, free of any formal group context. It would be someone helping a person across the street or someone helping a neighbor. Those would be examples of informal volunteering. That's not what I'm going to talk about. There's not much research on it, and that's one of the reasons. But formal volunteering is much more important. Formal volunteers do volunteer work in this group context and are members of some nonprofit group or service volunteer program. Although the informal volunteering is important, as I said, it's a little studied, so I'll concentrate on formal volunteering. The final set of definitions has to do with the kinds of groups and organizations that are found in the voluntary sector. A voluntary group, which I sometimes abbreviate as a VG, or a nonprofit group, which is synonymous, is a group that does a substantial amount of voluntary action during a specified time period. So you can see how I follow through with a linked set of definitions. First voluntary altruism, then voluntary action, and then voluntary groups as groups that do a lot of voluntary action. And there are two kinds of voluntary groups which I will talk about. The first kind of voluntary groups I call volunteer groups, where they're mainly run by volunteer effort. Most of them are grassroots associations, GAs as I will call them. The second main kind of voluntary group is quasi-volunteer groups, where they're mainly run by quasi-volunteer efforts. That is, people who are under-remunerated but get some pay. There's still one last type of definition I have to give, and that's the Service Volunteer Program, or SVP. A service volunteer program is a department of a larger organization that manages a set of volunteers who do work for that organization. Examples would include a hospital volunteer program, a museum volunteer program, a school volunteer program, and even volunteer programs for government agencies. We have in the United States volunteers that work for the Internal Revenue Service, the taxation branch of the government, and they do help to people who need to have help filling out their income tax forms, and there are many, many kinds of government volunteers. To sum up, voluntary altruism is my central value or motivation concept, and it drives voluntary altruistic action or voluntary action. In this paper, then, I will focus on pure, unremunerated volunteers who are active in the context of some fairly formal or semi-formal group. Formal, pure volunteers. Volunteerism as leisure. Studies of pure formal volunteerism in America have been done separately from memberships in grassroots associations and participation in service volunteer programs. The grassroots associations are freestanding autonomous groups, although they may be linked to a higher level organization, and service volunteer programs are these departments of a larger organization. Let me talk about affiliation and attendance at grassroots associations. One of the most thorough studies in the past decade was that by Verba, Schlossman, and Brady in their book Voice and Equality, Civic Volunteerism in American Politics. On page 63, they report the percent affiliated as members or contributors for a weighted sample of about 2,500 cases that resemble the American adult population. And they find that about 79% of the total sample are affiliated to at least one organization, and a substantial portion of all of these affiliates attended meetings. I've rearranged the figures in their table in descending order of frequency of affiliation, and I've got a overhead that you can look at. That's a rearranged table from Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, and shows you that charitable and social service voluntary associations by far have the largest percent affiliated out of the total population. All respondents here are a representative sample of the United States, so we're theoretically looking at all of the United States, followed by educational, business and professional, hobby, sports and leisure, and youth organizations rounding out the top 6. I won't go into the rest of them. You can see them on the overhead. Verba et al. Verba et al. Report separately that about 70% of American adults attend church several times a year or more. So this is another kind of volunteer activity. Going to church, participating in church choirs or church Sunday schools, or being an usher and so forth. That's volunteering also. It tends to be looked at separately from secular volunteering, but is there nonetheless. And there's a lot of it, at least in the United States. Now, the United States is a particularly religious country and probably has more church volunteering than most European countries, for instance. At the level of activity in grassroots associations, other studies have shown that about half the U.S. population is active in at least one grassroots association. Now, when I say active, it means they go to at least one meeting a year, or they have a post, an officership, or chairmanship, or on a committee, something like that. So half the adult population is active in at least one GA in America. People go to meetings and get active in various other ways, volunteering their leisure time to the group. And in addition, about the average American adult belongs to about 1.5 grassroots associations. So most people in America don't just belong to one association, they belong to 2 or 3, and some people belong to none, making the average about 1.5. Now, what about affiliation and attendance at grassroots associations elsewhere in the world? Grassroots associations are not an American phenomenon. I recently published an article on the international history of grassroots associations in 1997, tracing the origins of GAs to pre-literate tribes as early as 25,000 years ago, flourishing from about 10,000 years ago in advanced, settled horticultural societies all over the world, probably beginning in the Middle East. So, although some chauvinists in my country think that volunteerism is American as apple pie, it isn't. The earliest GAs were social clubs, often adult men's clubs in a tribe. They had their own quarters. It could be a dugout, it could be a cave, it could be a teepee. About 3000 BC, religious cults arose as grassroots associations, especially in Egypt, and a few thousand years later, occupational guilds abounded in Greece and Rome, among other places. Grassroots associations' prevalence has been increasing ever since, but especially in modern societies. There's a large jump in the frequency of grassroots associations when the Industrial Revolution takes place in a country, when a country goes from being dominated by agrarian workers to having a significant or substantial portion of people working in factories and industry. The Reformation in Europe was also a rich source of grassroots associations and other nonprofits in the form of new churches and sects. Many years ago, I edited a book that demonstrated in a contemporary way the presence of grassroots associations around the world on 5 continents. It's one of the 3 books in the series that Bob Stebbins mentioned. It was titled Voluntary Action Research 1974, The Nature of Voluntary Action Around the World. And it had sections with chapters on Asia, Eastern Europe, and Mideast, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Western Europe, and North America. So even 25 years ago, I could find people to write chapters on the grassroots associations in their respective countries. Now it should be much easier still. The focus of this international-looking book was on grassroots associations, which is quite different from the focus of Lester Solomon's Global Civil Society Project, which focuses on paid staff nonprofits where there are quasi-volunteers and paid staff that dominate the work activity. Now, these grassroots associations are in developing nations as well as developed nations, as Julie Fisher's wonderful book, The Road from Rio, so amply demonstrates. Just to give you a few examples which may not be familiar to people from first world countries, some examples of GAs in developing countries are the following. Squatter neighborhood associations, which are resident GAs in urban areas in several Latin American nations, including Mexico, and they have been successful in generating high levels of squatter participation and in attaining major goals like new services or other tangible benefits for their neighborhoods. Another example would be that 40 developing nations have rotating credit grassroots associations, which allow poor people to borrow occasionally after they have contributed regularly to the GA for a time. This is kind of a substitute for banks. They're partly economic and partly social GAs. And to give one last example, there are an estimated 80,000 Catholic base communities in Brazil and Central America, which are micro-churches of volunteers empowered to perform the sacraments for volunteer members without a priest. Now let me talk briefly about volunteerism and service volunteer programs, kind that are departments of a larger organization, whether a government, a large nonprofit, or even a business in the sense of a voluntary hospital. The most recent U.S. data are from the 1999 edition of Giving and Volunteering in the United States by Kirsch et al. Based on a weighted representative sample, again, of about 2,500 adult Americans, 18 years of age or older, Table 2 gives the percentage of people reporting volunteering assignments for the year 1998 by area of volunteer activity in descending order of frequency for formal settings, that is, leaving aside the informal volunteers. That's the table. The interesting thing is that there are 2 kinds of groups that come in the top 5 in both tables, the table for grassroots associations and the table for service volunteer programs. And those 2 are education and human services or social services. Those are in the top 5, whether you're talking about service volunteer programs or grassroots associations. A study of volunteerism in 14 European nations in 1990, and I'm sure there must be some more recent one, but I couldn't find it, edited by Justin David Smith and entitled, no relation, entitled Volunteering in Europe, found a variety of service volunteer programs present in all the countries of Western Europe studied, although at substantially lower levels than in Canada and the U.S. Remember, in Canada and especially the U.S., something like half the population is involved in these kinds of volunteer assignments, service volunteer programs. Volunteerism was strongest in these European countries in the areas of sports and recreation and in health, welfare, and use, and weakest in areas of conservation and animals and in community action, third world, and women. But there are wide inter-country variations. Well, having tried to demonstrate something about the magnitude of volunteering in the nonprofit sector, I want to turn to impact and meaning of such volunteerism. It's not sufficient to demonstrate that there is a lot of volunteerism that exists in leisure time activity all over the world, both in grassroots associations and service volunteer programs. Another important question is what it all means in the lives of the participants. What impact does it have? I shall undertake to answer this question separately for grassroots associations and service volunteer programs because the literature on the impact is separate and there isn't much on the service volunteer programs. I personally paid most of attention to the grassroots association impact literature. So first, grassroots association impact. Several expected kinds of impact tend to be present as a result of GA activity flowing from the structure and processes common to GAs generally in relationship to individuals and their relation to the larger community and society. In other words, it's the nature of grassroots associations that brings about the impacts that I'm going to talk about. The following is a list and general description of 5 major substantive types of GA impact, which I theorize from the research literature are most important for GAs. And I've combined some substantive impacts that could be separated in order to make the total set of impact types more compact and readily grasped by the listener. The first of the 5 types of impact is support, social support, and helping. GAs are inherently social and interactional, usually on a face-to-face basis because of their locality base and goals. Grassroots associations are based in a single locality, a neighborhood, sometimes just a building, sometimes a town or city. They all tend to generate interpersonal support and informal helping among members as one kind of member impact. Studies have shown that people develop friendships with the co-members of a grassroots association. So when they go to a grassroots association meeting and participate in that association, they develop friendships there, which fits with this particular impact of informal social support. Some 40% of American adults, according to Wuthnow, are in small social support mutual aid groups, which are especially important sources of social support by definition. They are self-help groups, Bible study groups, Sunday school classes, book and discussion groups, political and current events groups, sports and hobby groups. Wuthnow found in his national representative sample of such support groups that they were credited by 82% of their members with making you feel like you're not alone. That's social support. And by 72% with giving encouragement when you were feeling down, which is a kind of informal helping. And with 43% with helping through an emotional crisis, among other kinds of help. So people in grassroots associations depend on each other, make friends with each other, and give help to each other. In some instances, GAs have had non-member serving goals that fall into this category of helping. And they're able to turn internal cohesion into various kinds of service activities of potential or actual use to target non-members. So some examples of this would be disaster helping groups, emergency medical service groups, firefighting groups, and crime control groups, which are in many cities. In addition, there are indigenous service for development groups in developing countries, local grassroots associations that are trying to do development. Among local religious congregations in the U.S., there are probably, most of them are mainly paid staff voluntary groups, but some are grassroots associations. And most U.S. congregations provide some community social services using volunteers, as well as using volunteers to help with the production of the church service. Second topic of impact, information and education. In modern society, especially information and service post-industrial societies, all organizations tend to create some social reality for their members. They tend to portray a way of looking at social reality. GAs specifically tend to provide both their members and much of the non-member population cumulatively with various kinds of stimulation, information, and educational experiences. Deacon and Golding performed a broad mail questionnaire survey of voluntary organizations in the Midlands of England. They showed the importance in most kinds of grassroots associations in providing information to members and others in current information society. Some other kinds of GAs have a central focus on information. For instance, book discussion groups combine provision of information with personal growth. Youth groups, youth development groups like the Boy or Girl Scouts or the 4-H, which is specialized to America, emphasize skill and knowledge development in practical areas. There are other examples. Participation in amateur scientific GAs leads to accumulation of related scientific information, as in a book by Robert Stebbins in 1979. Lawson studied social movement GA members who learned new skills and techniques of protest and political action from their GAs, such as when and how to do a rent strike. So the education and learning and information that one gets from GAs does not necessarily just come for the cooler kinds of service-oriented GAs, but also comes for the hotter social protest kinds of groups. There's a great deal of learning that takes place in grassroots associations. In addition to emphasizing experiential knowledge as the basis of their healing and supportive effects, self-help GAs in particular usually convey information to participants about the problem of focus, whatever the self-help group is set up to focus on, and how to deal with the problem in everyday life, available services, available supportive people and sponsors in the GA, and how to think about oneself in a new way. This latter matter of worldview transformation is the most extensive and encompassing process of education or information provision. The information absorbed is internalized and leads to dealing with everyday life in radically new ways. For instance, the Alcoholics Anonymous member who makes such a transformation not only stops drinking alcohol, but avoids bars and drinkers and has a new philosophy of life. Sects and cults provide similar worldview transformations among GAs. There are some wonderful impact studies, one with a pre-test, post-test control group design and a job-finding club that demonstrate how the information from that club helped the members get jobs within 3 months, where only 65% of the control group non-members found jobs in 3 months. So there's some studies of impact that show the stark importance of information received from grassroots associations. Sociopolitical activation and influence is the third impact area. GAs often politicize their members and generate sociopolitical influence activity directed at non-members and external organizations. Members learn democracy directly from participation in GAs, partly because GAs of every type sometimes get involved in public affairs issues when they are relevant to the continued GA existence and or to specific GA goals, such as health or education or sports. GAs also politicize their members because of internal democratic processes and political discussion, which involve learning experiences for many members. The result is that active GA members tend to get more involved in a wide variety of political activities than less active members or non-members. Put in a single sentence, being a member of a GA tends to make you more political. Some examples of politicization types that have been found in the literature include more voting turnout for members, more registration to vote and becoming a political candidate, more attending of political meetings or signing a petition, creating or reinforcing commitment to advocacy work, and higher scores on a composite political participation measure. There have been some longitudinal studies to show that this is not just a correlation, but a matter of causality. People who were studied in a longitudinal study by Hanks and Eklund found that high school extracurricular activities, including GA activity, led strongly to adult GA activity, which in turn led to more voting and less alienation. GAs with internal or external goals which relate to public issues often have a political impact locally. GAs are not just internally focused, they can be externally focused on trying to do something for the nation that they're embedded in. This can come, for instance, through environmental health groups successfully resisting the siting of or operation of a hazardous waste incinerator or waste dump in their locality, or GAs can successfully resist broadcasting license renewals and affect TV program formats, among other manifestations of local influence. One GA influenced their city government to establish a short-term care center for the homeless. Another GA affected city land use decisions, and there are numerous other possible examples, hundreds. However, GAs are far from uniformly successful in their local political influence attempts, limited as they are by local and higher-level business and government sector elites, as well as by competition and conflict with other GAs. Many countries also put legal limits on political advocacy and campaigning by GAs and other nonprofits. GA internal weaknesses, their structure, also play a role in advocacy failure, as do the kind and scope of the problem. GAs have more political impact when they're parts of local coalitions or alliances, and when they are polymorphic, that is, branches of some higher-level geographic association. The fourth major impact area that I want to talk about is economic outcomes. Nearly everyone in every GA has some economic concerns. Most GAs tend to have some revenues, however small, and these can accumulate nationally into a large amount of money, many billions of dollars. I think I made an estimate once that it was $50 billion of the budgets of grassroots associations in America. All GAs involve some imputed economic value of participant time. Let me explain the term imputed value for those of you who are not familiar with it. The imputed value of volunteer time is the value that it would have if people were being paid for that as service workers. And you can calculate that using the service wage in the country at a particular time and take the hours of participant time, and you come up with a large economic value of the time. This accumulates, as I say, into very large dollar amounts. Also, GAs can increase business and professional job contacts of members, especially males. This has been documented in several studies. Many GAs can help provide members with some relevant experience for obtaining jobs and who lack recent job skills, often homemakers returning to the labor force. Through GAs, there are many productive, through GAs, people are more productive, if only informally, than would otherwise be the case. In other words, GAs are a context in which people can be more productive than they can be on their own. Valuable practical services for members and non-members are accomplished in the community, which can reduce municipal costs and taxes and increase municipal efficiency, such as volunteer firefighting corps, volunteer town committees. So cumulatively, these economic situation improvements help not just the GA members, but the economy and the society as a whole. GAs and networks of GAs play key roles in sustaining economic development and promoting psychological empowerment in developing nations. Successful results have been obtained from GA projects in agriculture, cooperatives, rotating credit availability, irrigation, a whole slew of other kinds of impacts. And I've already mentioned rotating credit cooperatives that are found in developing nations and squatter neighborhood associations, which are able to gain new services and tangible benefits for their neighborhoods. In addition, there are economic system support GAs that have a positive impact on both members and non-members locally, although most are polymorphic, being parts of larger national organizations. Farmers groups, unions, business people's groups, professional groups, all of these have special economic impact on the society in which they're embedded. The fifth impact area that I want to talk about is happiness and health. I don't really have much time to tell you about this. 5 minutes, yeah. It turns out that just participating in grassroots association has health and happiness byproducts. It tends to create more happiness and satisfaction with life and less deprivation, as well as to foster better health, less illness, less mortality or death, and quicker recovery from illness among members. Social support also lessens the impact of stressors and life crises on the individual, reduces the likelihood of health-damaging behavior as a result of the stress. So self-help groups, grassroots associations in general have a happiness and health impact on the people in their groups. And there are also special additional health benefits and happiness benefits from self-help GAs, which I don't have time to go into. Most of these self-help groups improve the happiness and health of their members. And the level of involvement in such groups is very important. Service volunteer program impact, I'll just get through very quickly and say that all but the third kind of impact of the 5 that I've talked about, socio-political activation and influence, tend to be found in service volunteer groups, service volunteer programs. So part of my conclusion is that the voluntary nonprofit sector makes a significant contribution to leisure, particularly through volunteerism involved. In a nation like the U.S., over 40 billion hours per year of volunteer time may be contributed through grassroots associations and service volunteer programs. Affiliation with GAs is widespread in the U.S. and elsewhere, as other studies show, as is service volunteer participation. All this volunteering has an impact on the 5 major areas, impact areas that I've talked about. And I'd like to say just a couple of words about the Global Forces local responses in relationship to grassroots associations. First, as far as globalization, there are grassroots associations and volunteer programs all over the world. More grassroots associations than service volunteer programs, but this is a growing area. In the U.S., one aspect of the globalization is transnational voluntary associations, which are associations that have some kind of a linkage with another country or several other countries. For instance, in the Friendship area, there's Sister Cities International. In the youth area, there's the Experiment International Living. In the professional and scientific area, there's the International Research and Exchange Board, and so on and so forth. There are also INGOs, international non-governmental organizations like the World Leisure and Recreation Association or the International Red Cross, and many, many others. There's 20,000 INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, and each of these tends to have many national non-governmental organizations that are members of them. Another aspect of globalization is the global history of GAs and nonprofits that I've talked about. And there is a global market as potential for GAs and volunteer groups, especially in the second world and the third world, where they're less frequent than they are in the first world. The local responses of volunteering, especially grassroots associations, include preservation of cultural identity, such as ethnic, religious, and nationality grassroots associations. Grassroots associations and volunteer groups are the content of civil society. That was a topic that was mentioned in the literature on this conference. And leisure events for these kinds of groups, nonprofits, range from INGO congresses such as this to local meetings which are held sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. So, in sum, volunteerism is growing globally in all kinds of nations, but volunteerism is largely local in scope with great diversity at this local level. Thank you very much.